The carriage wheels had ceased their grinding before Cecily allowed herself to look up. She had kept her eyes on her hands for the last 2 miles, on the worn seams of her traveling gloves, on the small leather ledger balanced in her lap that had been her mother's and was now the only thing she had brought from Vane House that no one could take away from her. She had kept her eyes down through the gatehouse and the long approach and the first sight of the stone facade rising against the November sky, because if she looked too soon, she would flinch, and she had promised herself she would not flinch today. She had been married 5 hours ago in a draughty chapel in Wiltshire to a man she had met twice, and she would not flinch at his house. It was very large. She understood that in the way one understands weather, simply, as a condition to be endured. The north wing was dark. Half the shutters on the second floor had not been opened, by the look of them, in some time. Sure. The gravel sweep was impeccably raked, she noticed, which meant at least one groundsman was earning his keep. The urns flanking the front steps had been emptied of their summer planting and not replaced, and the ivy on the east face had gone to wood from neglect. The house was not ill-kept, it was withheld from itself. Gideon Holt, Duke of Alderwick, stood at the top of the steps. He was taller than she remembered. Broader in the shoulders, beneath the dark-fitted coat, the white cravat so precisely arranged, it might have been carved from the same stone as the doorway behind him. He watched the carriage door open. He did not come down the steps. He did not offer his hand. She descended without assistance, which was not difficult, and met his eyes for the first time since the chapel. They were gray. They gave nothing. Behind her, as she climbed the steps, she heard one of the footmen, who had been sent ahead to ready the house, murmur something to another. She caught 3 words. Only. The Vane girl. She walked through the doorway of Alderwick as though she had heard nothing at all. If you have ever stood at the threshold of a house you did not choose, and understood immediately that it did not want you there, then you will already know what Cecily felt in the moment the doors closed behind her. Stay with this story a moment longer. She was about to turn his house to her own. She was 23 years old that November, which is an age at which one has not yet learned that the world's capacity for cruelty has a floor. Cecily had learned it earlier. She had been 16 when her mother died and left her sole manager of Vane House, its staff of 14, its gardens, its tenants, and its accounts, the last of which she had discovered, within a month of her mother's death, were not what they appeared. Her father, Baron Vane, had the affectionate, impractical disposition of a man who had spent 40 years being charmed by life and expected it to continue. He loved Cecily. In the mild, absent way a man loves a piece of furniture he has never had cause to move. She was simply there, and she was useful. And so he loved her. He had also, by the time she had properly inventoried the household books, gambled away £11,000 across 17 years of invisible debt. The creditor was Sir Roland Vane, a second cousin 3 times removed, who had been purchasing Vane's promissory notes from their various holders for a decade, with the patience of a man who understood that eventually the ground beneath a debtor shifts. When her father died, in August of that year, Sir Roland arrived at Vane House within the week. He was a man of middle height, and the sort of permanent self-satisfaction that arranges itself carefully into the expression of one simply reporting facts. The facts, as he reported them, were plain enough. The estate was his in all but name, and he had graciously agreed not to accelerate the debt's resolution, provided the late Baron's daughter was suitably settled before winter. Suitably settled. She had turned the phrase over in her mind for 3 months, until it had gone smooth. The Duke of Alderwick's solicitor had arrived at Vane House in September. The Duke, she was told, required a wife, of practical temperament, some organizational capability, and no demanding social ambitions. In exchange, she would retire the entirety of her father's debt, and Cecily would become Duchess of Alderwick, with all attendant security. He would trouble her as little as possible. The match was efficient. She had asked the solicitor one question. She had asked him why. The solicitor had cleared his throat and said that His Grace found himself in need of a chatelaine. someone to manage the household. His previous staff arrangements had proved unsatisfactory. Cecily had looked at her mother's ledger on the desk between them, and understood that she was being purchased for the same reason she had spent 7 years being kept, because she was useful, because she would run the thing quietly and capably and require nothing in return. She had signed the settlement. Alderwick in November was a house that had forgotten it was a house. That was the only way Cecily could describe it to herself on her first evening, when she walked through the ground floor rooms with a candle and her mother's ledger and began quietly to take inventory. The dining room table could seat 30 and was set for 1. The drawing room had been shut. Its furniture sat under Holland covers like a congregation of pale ghosts. The library was in use. She could tell by the cleared desk and the fire that had been recently banked, but 3 of its 4 walls of shelves had not been dusted in months. The housekeeper, a thin, gray woman named Mrs. Prang. Fellows followed Cecily through each room with the expression of someone watching a prisoner inspect her cell. The kitchen, Cecily discovered, was the locus of the house's hostility. Mrs. Haffera. Trent, the head cook, had been at Alderwick for 22 years. She had outlasted the first wife. The dismissal of the full household staff 3 years ago, and the arrival of the bare-bones replacement staff who had not dared challenge her domain. She expressed her feelings about the new Duchess of Alderwick through her cooking. The meals that arrived in the dining room were technically edible and, specifically, designed to communicate contempt. Cold soup in winter, overdone fowl, a pudding so airlessly plain it resembled an accusation. On the 3rd day, Cecily sent her compliments to the kitchen and did nothing else. She was making her own inventory of things that could wait. Not everything required immediate action. Some things required watching, and then deciding, and then moving, at exactly the right moment. She had learned that at 16, managing a household on diminished funds while her father assured himself everything was fine. She had learned to wait and to watch, and to know the precise difference between a problem that would solve itself and one that would worsen in the silence. On the 4th morning she found the Duke of Alderwick in the corridor outside the library. He stopped. She stopped. The corridor was narrow, and the morning light fell sidelong through the window at its far end, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at an unexpected thing he has not yet decided what to do with. "You are walking," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am assessing the south wing for damp." He looked at the small notebook in her hand. He said nothing. "The shutters on the 2nd floor have warped," she continued, since he appeared to require nothing from her. "And water has been getting in around the frames. The wall in the 3rd guest room is damp from the floor up to about here." She held the hand level with her chin. "If it is not addressed before the hard frosts come, the plaster will come away in the spring. I thought you should know." He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "The housekeeper," he began. "Mrs. Fellows has been aware of it for some time," Cecily said. "She informed me that the matter had been raised with your previous steward and was awaiting instruction." A pause. She watched something move behind his eyes that she could not name. "I will send for the builder," he said. "I have already drafted a letter," she said, "if you would care to sign it." He signed the letter that evening, passing it back to her through the study door, without opening the door fully, just a hand emerging with the paper, the way one might pass a thing through a slot. She stood in the corridor with the signed letter and the faint smell of tobacco from the study, and thought that she had perhaps misunderstood the nature of this marriage entirely. She had expected cold. She had expected distance. What she had not expected was that he would sign anything she gave him, at all. She did not let herself think about what that might mean. 3 days later, he left a note on the desk she had claimed in the morning room, a single line in a precise, dark hand, informing her that the builders were engaged and would attend the following Tuesday. She read the note twice. She set it face down on the desk and went back to the household account she had been working through. Her hand, when she picked up the pen, was entirely steady. Her pulse, which she could feel at the base of her throat, was not. She did not let herself think about that either. The household's resistance crystallized in the kitchen on the 7th day. Cecily had requested a meeting with Mrs. Way, Trent to discuss the winter menus, and she arrived at the appointed hour to find the cook occupied at the range and declining to turn around. Cecily stood in the kitchen doorway. The two kitchen maids kept their eyes on their work. "The fire popped, Mrs. Trent," Cecily said. "I have done menus for this house for 22 years, Mrs. Trent said, still to the range. "I know," Cecily said. "I have been looking at the accounts. You run a very efficient larder." The cook's shoulders shifted slightly. "I have also been looking at the menus from the past 3 years," Cecily continued. "And I notice that you are trained in French cookery. There are receipts in the kitchen book in what I assume is your hand from at least 10 years ago that are considerably more complex than anything you have been asked to produce recently." She waited. "It seems a waste, Mrs. Trent turned around. Her face was closed, guarded. "The face of a woman expecting a trap His Grace does not entertain," the cook said. "His Grace has a wife now," Cecily said. "I intend to ask him whether he is willing to receive a small dinner party. In January, if he agrees, I will need your full capabilities. If he does not agree, then we will continue as we are until circumstances change." She held the cook's gaze. "I am not asking you to surrender territory. I am asking you what you can actually do." The silence that followed lasted long enough for one of the kitchen maids to forget herself and look up. "I can manage a dinner for 16, Mrs. Trent said finally. "If I have 3 days' notice and the right provender, then that is what I will ask for," Cecily said. "And I will see that you have it." She did not know, until later, that Gideon had been standing in the corridor doorway for the latter half of that exchange. She did not know that he had arrived to resolve the matter himself, that he had heard from Mrs. Bende. Fellows, that the cook was making the new Duchess's situation untenable, and had come prepared to speak to Mrs. Trent in the particular quiet way that had made the staff afraid of him for 3 years. She did not know that he had stopped in the doorway and listened instead, and had not announced himself. She found out later from the look on young Thomas the footman's face, a look of cautious bewilderment, as though he had seen something he did not yet have a category for. The household began to shift after the kitchen encounter. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. It was the particular movement of a household that had been holding its breath and had now tentatively begun to exhale. Mrs. Fellows began to volunteer information rather than withhold it. The 2 parlor maids who had been pointedly invisible started to appear when called. Thomas, who had been navigating the arrangement with the careful neutrality of a young man who did not know where power had landed, began to look at Cecily directly when he spoke to her. She said nothing about any of it. She only noted it, the way she noted the improving state of the south wing walls, as evidence that the right things had been done at the right moment. The second time Cecily heard herself called the Vane girl came from Sir Roland Vane himself, who arrived unannounced on the 12th day, with 2 of his associates, and a self-congratulatory air that filled the entrance hall the way smoke fills a closed room. He was conducting what he called a friendly visit. He examined the house with proprietary interest, complimented his cousin's management in a tone that managed to encompass no actual compliment, and at the luncheon table remarked to one of his associates, as though Cecily were not present, that it was rather what one expected, was it not? When a duke took the Vane girl off the market, one did not get a diamond for a settlement price, he said, but one got something serviceable. Cecily set down her fork. She did not look at Sir Roland. She looked at the centerpiece, a winter arrangement she had commissioned from the kitchen garden the previous afternoon, because the dining room had been bare since she arrived, and bare rooms invited the wrong kind of gravity. She looked at the red berries and the dark sprigs of holly she had cut and arranged herself, and she counted 4 slow breaths across the table. She was aware that Gideon had gone very still. She picked up her fork. She spoke to Sir Roland's associate about the associate's estate in Shropshire, about which she knew a great deal because she had read everything in Alderwick's library about Shropshire agricultural practice the previous evening. Sir Roland watched this with the expression of a man whose conversational weapon has been lifted and used against him without his quite tracking how. That evening, Gideon appeared in the corridor outside her rooms. She opened the door at his knock, and he stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at her with that careful attention she was beginning to recognize as unusual. "He will be gone by morning," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "You did not require my intervention." "No," she said. She paused. "Thank you for being still." He looked at her for a moment. Some part of his face that was usually held flat moved slightly, towards something she could not name. He said good night. She closed the door and stood with her back to it, and pressed her palms against the worn wood, and did not let herself breathe properly for a long moment, because her pulse was doing something it had no business doing. She did not yet understand that he had been watching her the whole time and understood far more than she thought. She found the portrait by accident on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week. She had been working through the East Wing in her survey, the closed-off rooms, the furniture under covers, the places where the house had been put into a kind of suspension, and she had pushed open a door that she had assumed led to a secondary linen room. It did not. It led to the long gallery. It was cold. The windows were shuttered except for one, and the light that came through fell in a long gray stripe across the floor and the lower third of the paintings that lined both walls. She walked slowly because the gallery was astonishing 2 generations of Alaric ancestry, a winter landscape that stopped her breath, a study of dogs and morning light that she would have stood before for an hour given time. Then she came to the end of the gallery and stopped walking entirely. The portrait was larger than she expected. The woman in it was perhaps 25, fair, with something quietly luminous about her that the painter had captured or perhaps only guessed at. She was seated, and she was looking not quite at the viewer, but at a point slightly to the right, as though she had heard a sound outside the frame and had turned her head to listen. There was an intimacy in that half-turn, something so specific and human that Cecily felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. She heard a footstep behind her. She did not turn immediately. She gave him time, or gave herself time, or gave the room time to hold what it had been holding for 2 years. "I beg your pardon," she said at last, turning. "I did not know. I thought this was the linen store." Gideon was in the doorway. He was looking at the portrait, and the particular stillness that she had come to think of as his characteristic expression was gone. In its place was something so unguarded that she looked away from it, immediately the way one looks away from a person in the private act of grief. "She died in the spring of 1814, he said, the child with her. Cecily said nothing. She waited. "I was in London," he said. "Parliament was in session. She had written to tell me she did not feel well. I had intended to come home the following week." The words were level, entirely level. She understood in the moment of hearing them that this was not the first time he had said them, but was possibly the first time he had said them aloud to another person. "She would have told you. It was not your fault," Cecily said quietly. "She would have been being kind," he said. "She would also have been correct." She looked at the portrait again, at that tilted, listening face. What was she listening for, in the painting? She looks as though she hears something just outside the frame. A long silence. "Music," he said at last. She played. There was a piano in the next room. She used to play while she sat for the painter, and he said it made the sessions tolerable. She always had her ear turned toward the music she was not playing. Cecily looked at the portrait until she had the image properly fixed in her mind, not as a ghost, but as a fact. A woman who had listened for music. "There is a piano in the music room," she said. "I noticed it is badly out of tune." "It has not been played," he said. "No," she said. "It might be again, though." "If you would allow it." He did not answer immediately. He looked at the portrait one more moment, and then he looked at Cecily. And there was something in the gray eyes that she had not seen there before. Something that was not coldness and was not distance, but was the thing that exists between those two, the particular wariness of a man who has understood somewhere in the conversation. that something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. You may do as you see fit with the music room, he said. It is your house now. She held those words carefully in the walk back from the gallery. His house, he had called it. Her house, he had called it. Both things could not be precisely true at once, and yet she thought they might both be entirely true. She thought of her mother's ledger in the study drawer, the column of figures in her mother's hand from 1804. She thought of the column she had been building beside it. The crisis arrived on a Wednesday, folded inside a letter that Cecily was not meant to see. She had not meant to intersect it. She had been in the study, her study in practice now, since Gideon had stopped objecting to her presence there and had, in the past week, taken to leaving the connecting door to the library ajar. Young Thomas brought in the morning correspondence and, misreading the arrangement of things, set it on her desk rather than the Duke's. She was halfway through the household accounts and had already opened the first 3 letters before she understood the 4th. It was from Sir Rowland Vane's solicitor. It outlined in the careful prose of a man who knew how to say an unpleasant thing in the cleanest possible language that Sir Rowland had become aware of certain irregularities in the Ellerwick estate's financial position, a position that had led His Grace to require a marriage of convenience in some haste, and which might prove of interest to parties with a stake in the late Baron Vane's debt resolution. The letter further noted that should the Duchess of Ellerwick wish to pursue a private settlement with Sir Rowland's office, he would be willing to discuss terms that would allow her a suitable departure from Ellerwick, with her dignity intact. The current arrangement, the letter suggested, appeared to have been entered into under some financial duress on His Grace's part, and she could hardly be expected to remain in a house that had taken her for her father's debts and would set her aside come spring when the estate's obligations were renegotiated. She read the letter twice, then she heard a footstep and looked up. Thomas stood in the doorway, gone pale. "My lady," he began, "I beg your pardon. That was not meant to come to you, the correspondence from Mr. Hale's office." "No," Cecily said, "it was not." The footman, 17, she had learned, from a village 2 miles east, with a mother who took in sewing, looked at her with the expression of someone waiting to see which direction a storm would blow. He had been the one, she now remembered, who had brought the gossip from the village 2 weeks past. She had heard him in the hall, and he had said what the village was saying, which was that the Vane girl had been put at Ellerwick to manage a difficult house, and would last until spring, when the Duke's affairs were sorted. He had not known she was in the next room. His face, when he had understood, had been the face of someone who had done harm. He had not intended. "Which gossip from the village are you most recently aware of?" she asked. Thomas looked at the floor. "That His Grace has debts," he said. "That the estate. There was a fire, my lady. 6 years ago, the village of Holt's Mill, the tenant village, on the northern edge of the estate. 23 houses. His Grace rebuilt them. All of them, used his own income for 3 years running. There are those who say he has stretched the estate past." He stopped. "Past what?" she said gently. "Past the point of holding it comfortable like," Thomas said, "my lady." Cecily set down the letter. She looked at the household accounts open before her. Then she looked at the estate accounts she had been slowly teaching herself to read over the past fortnight, the columns of figures she had been building into a shape, and she understood, in the particular way that comes from years of managing numbers through inadequate means, exactly what she was looking at. He had rebuilt 23 houses and had not told anyone. He had been quietly living on a fraction of what his income should have produced, absorbing the cost with the same silence with which he absorbed everything. The estate had been running below its proper capacity as a result. The staff he had dismissed 3 years ago, she had assumed, were let go for grief, or for the desire for isolation, It had also been economy. The skeletal household she had inherited was not the consequence of a man retreating from life. It was the consequence of a man quietly paying for 23 families to have roofs above their heads and cutting every other cost he could find to make the arithmetic work. She turned to a fresh page of her own notebook and began to work. The thing about the management of a large household that most people do not understand is that it is not principally about thrift. It is about understanding which expenditures produce value, and which produce only the appearance of value. By the time the October darkness came in, Cecily had found in the Alaric accounts 14 separate categories of expenditure that had been retained through inertia rather than utility. There was a subscription to a London wine merchant, whose prices had been uncompetitive for 6 years, standing contracts with 3 local suppliers, whose costs had risen 40% since the contracts were drawn, a quarterly payment to a factor whose role had been rendered redundant by changes to the estate management structure 2 years before. None of it had been noticed, because no one had been looking at all of it at once. She was looking at all of it at once. She worked until 2 in the morning. She went to bed. She rose at 6 and returned to it. By Thursday evening she had a document of 11 pages in her neat, decisive hand, outlining precisely how £3,040 per year could be recovered from the Alaric household budget without reducing the quality of any service or the wages of any staff member. She copied it fair. She set it on the desk. She did not bring it to Gideon. She set it on his side of the connecting door and left it there for him to find. He found it the following morning. She was at breakfast when she heard the connecting door open. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with her 11 pages in his hand, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen in the gallery, the unguarded one, the one that did not know what to do with itself. "You did not need to do this," he said. "No," she said. "I know." "The financial difficulty is," he began. "Temporary," she said. "If these adjustments are made, and if the northern drainage project is completed before the spring thaw, which the estate accounts suggest has been postponed 3 times already, then by this time next year Alaric will be in a considerably stronger position." She poured her tea. "I am not a woman who leaves problems to solve themselves." He sat down. Not at the far end of the table where he had sat at every breakfast for the past 3 weeks. He came and sat across from her, near enough that she could see the faint line between his brows, near enough that when he reached for the coffee pot his sleeve came within an inch of her hand. He poured his coffee and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, his voice quiet, "The village, Holt's Mill. You have read the account of it." "Yes, I did not do it to be admired," he said. "I know that too," she said. The silence between them was different now. She could feel the difference in it, the way one can feel a shift in atmospheric pressure before rain. It was no longer the silence of 2 strangers sharing a house. It was something else, and she did not trust herself to name it, but her hands were steady on the teacup, and the morning light was coming in through the east window for the first time in 3 weeks, because she had asked Thomas to open the shutters. The room was warm. He looked at the pages in his hand. He looked at her. He said with the quiet of a man who has learned to ration what he allows himself to ask, "Where did you learn to do this?" "My mother," she said. "She kept every account, every contract, every supplier's agreement. For Vane House, from the day she married my father until she died. She wrote everything down. She taught me to look at numbers the way you look at a map, to understand not just what is there, but why it is there, and what would happen if it changed." She paused. "After she died, I had to do it myself." He was quiet. "The ledger I brought," she said, "is hers. I have been adding Alaric to it." Something crossed his face that she could not entirely name, something that sat between gratitude and sorrow, and something else, something more immediate than either. "Then it is in good hands," he said. Lady Alderton arrived on Friday with a party of 6. She was a woman in her late 60s, silver-haired, magnificently positioned, and accustomed to defining the terms of any room she entered. She had been the ranking female presence in this county for 30 years, and the arrival of a new Duchess of Alaric was, in her estimation, a matter requiring personal assessment. She had not been invited. She arrived with the breezy confidence of a woman who understood that at her level of social authority, the distinction between invited and uninvited had ceased to be meaningful. Sir Roland Vane arrived 2 hours behind her. He had not been invited either, but Lady Alderton's presence gave him the necessary cover. and his solicitor's letter had not been answered. Cecily received them in the drawing room, which was no longer under Holland covers. She had had the room uncovered and aired in the 3rd week of her residence, had arranged the furniture to its best purpose, had set a fire in the grate, and flowers from the kitchen garden on the central table. The room looked like a room in which a duchess lived. This was intentional. Lady Alderton swept in, assessed the room, assessed Cecily, and said, with the practiced warmth of someone used to delivering pleasant-sounding verdicts, "My dear, how wonderfully you have managed. One does rather expect Alderwick to be grim, does one not? And here you have made it quite cheerful." She turned to her companion and added in the half-lowered voice of a woman who had never quite understood how well sounds carry, "Hardly what one expects from a girl in her position." It was not posed as a question. Cecily offered tea. The afternoon progressed with the surface politeness of a battle in miniature. Lady Alderton questioned with cordial thoroughness the arrangement of the staff, the planned winter entertainments, and the management of the household accounts, all with the particular air of someone assessing a temporary appointment. She praised things in ways that contained invisible conditions. She expressed concern in ways that positioned her concern as a form of authority. Sir Rowland said little, but smiled at intervals. The smile of a man whose letter had been, in his calculation, a courtesy warning that had not yet been properly heeded. Gideon was present. He sat in the chair by the window and said almost nothing, which had the effect of a very large, very quiet weight in the room. Cecily was aware of him in the peripheral way she had become aware of him everywhere in the house, the specific register of his stillness, the quality of attention he paid to things he appeared not to be watching. At 4 o'clock, Lady Alderton said, in the smooth tones of someone making an arrangement for another person's benefit, that she had been speaking to several families in the county who were concerned, naturally that the management of Alderwick, in the current circumstances, was rather a great deal to ask of. Well, any young woman, but particularly one who had come to the house under rather particular conditions, she said she would be happy to suggest a more experienced woman who might assist, perhaps in a supervisory capacity. A woman of Mrs. Blaptertu, such and such as standing, who had managed 3 large houses and would know how these things ought to be done. Cecily set down her teacup. She did not look at Lady Alderton. She looked at the flowers on the central table, the dark holly and the winterberries she had cut herself from the kitchen garden, because the dining room had been bare when she arrived and she had remedied it, as she had remedied the damp walls, and the uncovered drawing room, and the emptied larder accounts, and the blocked northern drainage that had been 3 years postponed. She had brought all of those things. No one had done them for her. "I appreciate the concern," Cecily said with the particular pleasantness of a woman who does not need to raise her voice. "Alderwick is quite well managed, as I believe the household books will confirm if Lady Alderton wishes to review them. I have made several improvements in the past month, which His Grace has approved, and I anticipate further improvements in the new year. If there are specific matters you feel require attention, I am happy to discuss them." Lady Alderton smiled the smile of someone shifting register. "Of course, my dear. One only wants to be sure that a house of this position is in the proper hands." "Given?" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. "It is in mine," said Gideon. He had not moved from his chair. His voice was quiet. It did not require volume. Lady Alderton turned toward him with the expression of a woman recalculating. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Alderwick is hers." He looked at Cecily, and the gray eyes were not giving nothing now. They were giving everything, all at once, in the measured way of a man who has been careful a long time and has decided to stop being careful. I would have no other mistress of it. The room held that sentence the way a room holds a sound after a bell has struck. Sir Rowland's smile had not quite resolved into its next expression. Lady Alderton's fan, which she had been holding at a precise angle throughout the afternoon, descended 2 inches and stayed there. Cecily did not look at Lady Alderton. She looked at Gideon, and something in her chest that had been held tightly for a very long time, for 7 years perhaps, or for 23, came slowly loose. She reached for her teacup. Her hand was steady. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. It was a small thing to say. It was the only thing there was to say in that room, in that company, and she said it as though it were ordinary, as though this were simply a man confirming a domestic arrangement, rather than a man who had crossed some threshold in himself and stood now on a different ground and was not going back. Lady Alderton remained for dinner, because she was too accomplished a woman to leave in defeat, and the dinner was too good to forego. She ate 3 courses of Mrs. Trent's recovered French cookery with the expressions of someone revising an assessment she had already committed to, and she said, on her way out, that the Duchess of Alarwick had managed the house extremely well for someone so newly arrived. It was as close to a retraction as Lady Alderton had ever been known to come, and 2 of her companions registered it as such, and would speak of it for months. Sir Rowland departed before dinner, citing an engagement he had not mentioned at his arrival. No one asked after him. Thomas, taking his coat, wore the expression of a young man who had correctly read the direction of the weather and was very glad he had stood where he had stood. After the guests were gone, after the drawing-room had been set to rights and the house had settled into its late evening quiet, Cecily went back to the study. She sat at her desk and she opened her mother's ledger, and she added Alarwick's first complete inventory to it in her own hand, in the column beside the last entry her mother had made, a note about the price of tallow candles at the Wiltshire market in 1804. Her mother's handwriting and her own, 17 years apart, the same column, the same careful figures. She heard the connecting door to the library open. She said without looking up, "I will be another half-hour." "Take your time," Gideon said. He did not go back through the door. She was aware after a moment that he had sat down in the chair to the left of the fireplace, the one with the slight wear on its arm where a hand had rested many thousands of times before. The fire was burning low. She could hear the scratch of her pen and the settling of the coals, and nothing else. She worked for another 30 minutes. He stayed. When she finally closed the ledger and looked up, he was watching her in the way she had, from the beginning, thought of as looking at a thing he had not yet decided what to do with. She understood now that she had been wrong about what that look meant. It was not the look of a man who had not decided. It was the look of a man who had decided and was reckoning with what the decision asked of him. "She would have liked you," he said. She knew who he meant. She had good taste, Cecily said. She listened for music. Something happened to his face that she did not think had happened to it in a long time. It was brief, and it was slight, and it was the most she had seen of him, the most any room in this house had seen of him, she suspected, in a very long time. "The piano is being tuned next Tuesday," he said. "I asked the instrument maker to come from the village." She looked at him across the firelit room. "Do you play?" he asked. "Adequately," she said. "My mother was the talent." "Then you may teach me," he said. "I have always wanted to learn." "I never had the patience for it." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at this man in his chair by her fire, in her house, asking her to teach him a thing she had not yet offered. She thought of the woman in the gallery with her head turned toward sound. She thought of her mother's handwriting in the column on the left, and her own on the right, and the space between them that had been waiting to be filled. "All right," she said. Outside, the first snow of the winter had begun to fall. She could not yet see it. But she would in the morning. When she went to open the shutters, she had asked Thomas to unbar and found the grounds white and still. She would stand at the window, with a morning cold against the glass, and feel for the first time in her memory that she was standing in a place that was hers. Not because she had been put there. Not because she was useful, but because she had reached into it with both hands and made it so. The ledger was on the desk. The shutters were open. In the kitchen below, Mrs. Trent was planning a menu for 16. In the north wing, the new plasterwork was drying. Behind repaired window frames, solid and quiet in the cold. And in the chair, by the fire, learning to stay, sat the Duke of Alarwick. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. There are more stories waiting, and every one of them belongs to a woman who refused to be less than she was,